Hi there, welcome back to Nature in Code. In this video, I'd like to talk about the concept of a scope. If you look at our code here, specifically at this function, create next generation, when we developed this function, we used variables here, P and Q, that we had defined up here to calculate new values and then overwrite other variables, a1, 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 a2, and so on, that we also defined out up here outside of this function. This felt very natural and we didn't give it a second thought. Indeed, what's happening here is that you're using variables that have been defined in the global scope. Anything you define outside of a function in JavaScript is in the global scope, which means you can access it from anywhere else in your code. It feels quite natural to do that and comes in quite handy most of the time. Be aware that if you ever talk to a professional JavaScript programmer who's working on very complex and large JavaScript projects, they will probably tell you that the global scope is potentially quite dangerous because any variable defined outside of a function is in the global scope and therefore can be accessed and overwritten from anywhere else. And that can become quite dangerous if you have very large programs to manage. However, as part of this course, the programs that we'll be writing are fairly small and totally self-contained. And so in this case, the global scope really isn't a dangerous idea. And in fact, it's quite a handy concept. As you might have guessed, the fact that there's a global scope indicates that there's also a local scope. And yes, indeed, that's true. If you scroll down here, the variable shifter is in fact in the local scope. So any variable that you define within a function with the keyword var is a local variable in that function. It is in the local scope of that function, which means you cannot access it anywhere else but in that function. And that's also quite handy most of the time. You often want to define a variable within a function. You want to work with that variable throughout the function, but then when you're done with the function, you really want to forget about it. And that's where the local scope comes in, and it's quite handy. So I just mentioned that the local scope occurs when you're within a function and you define your variables with a keyword var. Now there's a very dangerous thing in JavaScript, which is that if you define a variable without the keyword var, even when it's within a function, it is in the global scope. And yes, you can define variables without the keyword var. You haven't heard it from me. It's actually not a good idea to do this because it can be quite confusing, especially because these variables will then be in the global scope, where indeed you would mostly assume that variables that you define within a function are actually only available within that function. And that is true as long as you use the keyword var. However, if you don't use the keyword var, the variable will be in the global scope. Let's make a quick example just to demonstrate that. I'm actually going to just copy this whole file here, and I'm going to open a new document. I'm going to paste this, and I'm just going to get rid of the JavaScript here. I'm going to start from scratch. So imagine I would write a function that I'm going to call test1, and all it would do is it would define a variable called foo, and I'm going to assign it just some random value, let's say 4. Now let me define a second function, okay, called test2, and all that function does is it logs the value of foo. That's all it does. Now imagine I would call test1 first, and then immediately after that I would call test2. Oops. So what would happen? Oh yeah, let me save this here as scope.html. Okay, so what would happen here if I loaded this document in the browser? Well, let's see. Okay, first we will call test1. Test1 would define foo and assign it the value 4, but because we didn't use the keyword var here, foo would actually be in the global scope. Then we would call test2, and test2 would try to print into the console the value of foo. So there is no definition of foo here within the function, so there's no local foo. If JavaScript doesn't find a local foo, it will search for a global foo, and because we defined one up here, it will find that, and so it will print 4, which is the value of the global variable foo. So let's go over to the browser and open this document. I'm just going to type this here in the address bar scope, and indeed there it is, 4. So this works well, as we expected it to work. Now let's go back into our code, okay, and change something seemingly small, which is we'll add the keyword var here. Now something fundamentally changes. Foo now is a local variable. It's in the local scope, not in the global scope anymore. Because as we said before, if a variable is defined within a function with the keyword var, it is in the local scope. So this time when we call test2, there will be no local variable here within test2, but there will also be no global foo, because this foo here is local to the function test1. So what would happen? Well, let's save it, go over to the browser, reload the document. This is what happens. An error occurs. And in this particular case, this error is called an uncalled reference error. And here the message is pretty clear. Foo is not defined. And that is true. Foo is not defined here in the global scope. And there's also no local foo here in test2. So test2 really doesn't know what to do with this foo, and that's why this error is caused. All right, so that's just a small example. You may think, well, okay, why would I ever need this? How is this useful to me? Well, I just wanted to make sure that you realize there is such a thing as a scope. Some variables can be accessed from anywhere, others can just be accessed in the function. I think most of these things actually feel very natural, but they only feel natural if you stick to one simple rule, and that simple rule is always define your variables with the keyword var, and then you're good. Then things will behave as you would expect them to. The variables that you define outside the functions are global, and the variables that you define inside the functions are local to those functions. So if there's one take-home message here, it's that always define variables with the keyword var. All right, well, that ends this video. In fact, this is also the last lecture of this chapter. And just to wrap up, you've actually learned a whole lot in this chapter, so congratulations on that. Just to reiterate real briefly, we started this whole journey by defining evolution, and evolution is the change of allele frequencies in a population over time. We then introduced the concept of an allele, which is simply a variant of a specific gene, the idea of a genotype, and then we talked about Hardy-Weinberg and explained what the Hardy-Weinberg principle is, which simply says that in a world where the allele frequencies don't change, your genotype frequencies will be at very specific values, and those are the Hardy-Weinberg frequencies. And if they're not there at the moment, then they will be there within one single generation. So that's the Hardy-Weinberg principle, which we then implemented in code over here. So let me close this file. So this is Hardy-Weinberg in code, in JavaScript code, and it uses variables, it uses functions, and it uses iterations. So you've built a program that uses already most of the key ingredients of a programming language. So well done, and I'll see you in the next video for another chapter.